By now, you've probably heard of Bishop Buddy. She's the bishop of the National Cathedral of the Episcopalian Church in Washington, D.C. And the day after Donald Trump's inauguration, she spoke at the National Prayer Service with Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance in attendance. And in her 15-minute sermon, she had some strong words. She said, and I said, strong but gentle. She said, "Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you, and as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God." Now, at that point, I would say that what she's doing here is setting up her words to say, you want to invoke divine providence? Well, you better put up or shut up, because if God's hand is on you, it will be expressed through your consistent following of what he teaches, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's what she goes on to say. She says, "In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. People who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meatpacking plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals. They may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques, synagogues, gurdwaras, and temples. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here. Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger." So um, Trump was offended, and I'm going to get to that, but his millions of Christian followers were also offended at Bishop Buddy's words. I suspect some were offended that she mentioned gay, lesbian, and transgender children. But the reality is that there are sexual minorities, people, adults, and minors who understand themselves to be transgender or gay. And whatever you think of their experience, that is their self-understanding. They experience, among other things, higher rates of depression, discrimination, and a resulting understandable fear at what the Trump administration might bring for them. And yes, you could have compassion on them, whatever your additional understandings of LGBT issues may be. Then there are people who, quote, may not be citizens or have the proper documentation. And Bishop Buddy eloquently describes these people that they exist throughout society. They work jobs that many people in the wider public do not want to work, such as poultry farms or meat packing plants. You might additionally say picking fruit. They work in hospitals, they work in hotels. They pay taxes. They are good neighbors. They are members of faith communities. And many of them have fled war zones and persecution. Have compassion on these people. All of these people she's talking here about are identified together in terms of their vulnerability. And what she is describing here is no different than or what Jesus talks about in Matthew 25 when he defines the follower, his true follower, the sheep, as distinguished from the goats, by being those who feed those who are hungry, who give drink to those who are thirsty, who give invite and show hospitality to the stranger, give clothes and food and medicine and visitation. You are defined as a follower of Jesus, not by the creed you confess or your political affiliation, but first and foremost by how you treat the most vulnerable people in society. That is how Jesus defines sheep. The fact that Donald Trump and his followers are constantly attacking, and that the MAGA movement itself, back to June 2015, when it was launched by attacking Mexicans as rapists and murderers, that movement has defined itself through the metaphor and the literal image of a wall being built. It has defined itself with xenophobia and othering vulnerable groups. It has constantly placed itself in exact opposition to the very teaching here of Jesus. This is how Donald Trump responded to Bishop Buddy. He said the so-called bishop who spoke at the National Prayer Service on Tuesday morning was a radical left hardline Trump hater. You see, it's easy for Donald Trump to marginalize her by being political and by personalizing it as an attack on him, rather than saying what she is doing is an appeal for the most vulnerable, and that if he wants to claim the teaching of Jesus, he had better follow the teaching of Jesus. He goes on and says she brought her church into the world of politics in a very ungracious way. And from there on, he redoubles down. He doubles down on a lot of his anti-immigrant, anti-migrant, anti-refugee, othering and dehumanizing rhetoric. Again, saying they to and they kill people. They come from jails and mental institutions. This is no different than the rhetoric he's been using for the last 10 years. So clearly, her appeal fell on deaf ears. But I want to conclude by coming back to his claim that somehow she was being ungracious by speaking out for the most vulnerable members of the population. Take a look at how Jesus began his ministry in Luke chapter 4. He goes to the synagogue in Nazareth and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, and set the oppressed free to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. In other words, what Jesus began his ministry doing was saying, I'm going to embrace the very people Donald Trump has established his MAGA movement for 10 years by othering, dehumanizing, and attacking. However, Jesus doesn't make it personal at first. He simply reads from the scroll, and people praise him when they hear this. Verse 22, all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son? He asked. But Jesus doesn't leave it at that. At that point, in the rest of this anecdote of this pericope, he turns to that audience, that congregation in the synagogue, and he points out, beginning in verse 23, these people are in fact hypocrites. They profess to embrace and accept the words of the prophet Isaiah, and yet they do nothing to help the vulnerable. And in fact, it is the people on the outside, such as, for example, the widow in Zarephath or Naaman the Syrian, who is being more faithful than the people within the synagogue. And here's how they respond. All the people in the synagogue, verse 28, were furious when they heard this. They were so furious that they grabbed Jesus and they attempted to throw him off a cliff and to murder him. Of course, Jesus escaped. But the point being, if you thought Bishop Buddy was ungracious, you should try attending a service where Jesus is preaching and where Jesus has a few words to say about how Donald Trump, for the last 10 years, and his MAGA movement have treated the most vulnerable people in society.